Playing pretend again, are we? Vanessa's text message glowed on my phone screen 3 days before the event, and I felt the familiar sting settle in my chest like it had found a permanent home there over the past 4 years. My sister had perfected the art of dismissal, could reduce my entire professional life to a joke with just 4 words and a strategically placed question mark. I stared at the message, sitting in my home office surrounded by client contracts and marketing analytics reports that represented something real, something substantial, something that apparently my family would never see as legitimate, no matter how many times I tried to explain it. I'm Emma Richardson, I'm 32 years old, and I had just invited my family to what I carefully described as an important professional event, without telling them the full truth about what they'd be walking into, because honestly, I was tired of my words meaning nothing to them. For 4 years, I had been building my online marketing consulting business from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks, landing clients, generating real revenue, creating actual results, and for 4 years my family had treated it like an extended hobby phase I'd eventually grow out of. My younger sister Vanessa, 29 and golden, had always been the achievable child in my parents' eyes, the one who did things right, who followed the proper path, who had the corporate marketing director title at a mid-sized firm that came with business cards my mother could show her friends without embarrassment. My business was always Emma's little venture, or that online thing she does, despite the fact that I had built something from nothing, had clients across 3 countries, had a team working under me, had generated revenue that would make most people's eyes water. But none of that mattered at family dinners where Vanessa's minor promotion got champagne toasts, while my first $100,000 year got a distracted, "That's nice, dear," before the conversation shifted back to my sister's achievements. The pattern was so established, so predictable, so deeply carved into our family dynamic that I could script the conversations before they happened. "When will you get a real job with benefits?" my mother asked at least once a month, genuine concern in her voice like I was struggling instead of thriving. My father, who had spent 40 years in finance, looked at me with this subtle disappointment that I hadn't followed his path, hadn't pursued the stability and structure he valued above everything else. And Vanessa, beautiful, successful Vanessa, had sent me this text about "another one of your little networking things" in response to my invitation, her tone dripping with that familiar condescension that made me feel small even when I knew I shouldn't let it. I remember the exact moment I understood how deeply the pattern had embedded itself into our family dynamics, how thoroughly I had been written into the role of the disappointing daughter who couldn't quite get her life together. It was 18 months ago, right around the time my business had crossed the $70,000 revenue mark for that quarter. And I had driven to my parents' house for Sunday dinner with a bottle of champagne and this hopeful lightness in my chest because I thought finally, I had something they couldn't dismiss or minimize. Vanessa had just gotten promoted to senior marketing director at her firm, a title change that came with a modest salary increase and a slightly larger office. And my parents had planned this elaborate celebration dinner at Giovanni's, the expensive Italian place downtown where reservations took weeks to secure. I arrived early, found my mother in the kitchen preparing appetizers even though we'd be eating out, and I told her about my quarterly numbers, about the 3 new clients I'd signed, about the campaign results that had one client already renewing for another 6-month contract. She smiled at me, that distracted smile I'd seen 1,000 times, and said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," in the exact tone you'd use with a child who just showed you a crayon drawing, before immediately shifting to discuss what she'd wear to Vanessa's celebration dinner. My father came home an hour later, and when I tried again to share my business milestone, he patted my shoulder and said, "Just make sure you're putting money away for retirement, Emma, since you don't have a 401k, like my success was somehow evidence of future failure." Vanessa arrived last, dramatic and glowing, and the energy in the house completely transformed as my parents orbited around her achievement, asking detailed questions about her new responsibilities and salary and team size. I sat on the couch with my unopened champagne bottle, watching my family celebrate my sister's corporate ladder climb while my actual entrepreneurial success sat unacknowledged in the corner like an embarrassing relative no one wanted to introduce. At dinner that night, surrounded by Vanessa's coworkers and our parents' friends, I tried one more time to share what felt like a significant professional milestone, and I got exactly 4 words into explaining my quarterly revenue before Vanessa launched into a story about her first day in the new position, and everyone's attention swung to her like she was the sun, and I was barely a distant star they'd forgotten to chart. That night, I drove home with my champagne still corked, and I cried in my car for 20 minutes before I could compose myself enough to walk into my apartment, and I made a decision that I didn't fully understand until months later. I would stop trying to make them understand with words, stop trying to translate my success into language they'd value, and instead, I would simply build something so undeniable that they'd have to see it whether they wanted to or not. The family WhatsApp group told the whole story in miniature. Vanessa posted about getting a new company laptop and received 47 responses with celebrations and emojis, while my announcement about hiring my second contractor got 3 responses, one from my aunt in Minnesota who barely knew what I did, and the others were polite thumbs-up reactions from my parents that felt more obligatory than genuine. Even my college graduation, summa cum laude with honors in business and marketing, had been overshadowed when Vanessa announced her engagement the same weekend, and suddenly, my academic achievement became a footnote to her relationship milestone, barely mentioned at the family gathering that somehow transformed into an impromptu engagement celebration. 6 months ago, everything changed in a way that should have been celebrated with my family, but instead became another milestone I processed alone in the silence of my home office. Another achievement that I knew would be diminished or dismissed if I tried to share it before the results became undeniable. I landed a Fortune 500 client, a massive telecommunications company based in Chicago that found me through a referral from a smaller client whose campaign I'd transformed the previous year. And the contract negotiation alone felt surreal as I sat on video calls with their executive team discussing strategy and deliverables and budget numbers that made my hands shake when I typed them into the proposal document. The campaign I designed for them was complex and innovative, combining influencer partnerships with data-driven content strategy and a social media approach that I'd been developing and refining over 4 years of trial and error with smaller clients. And I poured everything I had learned into making it work because I knew this was the kind of opportunity that could define a career. 3 months into the 6-month contract, the results started coming in, and they weren't just good, they were exceptional, extraordinary. The kind of numbers that made the client's marketing VP send me an email with 3 exclamation points saying they'd never seen this kind of ROI from a digital campaign. By the end of the contract, my campaign had generated $4.2 million in tracked revenue for the client, a number so large I had to read it several times to believe it was real, and my consulting fee for the project was $280,000, which was more than I'd made in total during my first 2 years of business combined. The industry recognition followed quickly after that, because success stories that dramatic don't stay quiet in the marketing world, and suddenly I was getting emails from conference organizers and trade publications and other businesses that wanted to replicate those results. The Digital Marketing Innovator Award nomination came through in an email that I read 5 times before I accepted it was real, and when the conference organizing committee asked if I'd be willing to speak about my journey from starting a solo consultancy to landing major clients, I said yes, even though the thought of speaking in front of hundreds of industry professionals made my stomach twist with anxiety. By that point, I had built my team to 6 skilled contractors, specialists in different areas who I brought in on various projects, and my annual revenue was approaching $900,000, a number my father would respect if he knew about it, a milestone my mother would finally recognize as real success if she understood what it meant. I had invested in professional development, attended smaller conferences, built relationships with other consultants and business owners, created a network of peers who understood what I'd built, and valued the expertise I'd developed. When the conference organizers officially invited me as the keynote speaker and announced I'd be receiving the award at the event, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. This would be the moment I showed my family the truth of my success, not by explaining it over a dinner table where my words would be dismissed or talked over, but by letting them see it in an environment where the evidence would be overwhelming and undeniable. I sent the invitation carefully worded as an important professional event, without specifying my role, and I wrestled with the decision for days, asking myself if I should just tell them outright that I'd be receiving an award and giving the keynote speech. But every time I considered it, I remembered years of trying to make them understand with words that never seemed to land, never seemed to matter, never seemed to change their fundamental perception of my business as something small and temporary. I bought my mother a new dress, told her it was for the event, something elegant and formal that I knew would make her feel special, and I bought my father a new tie, subtle hints about the importance of the occasion that they accepted without really questioning what kind of event would warrant such gifts. I was tired of my words being dismissed before they could even form complete thoughts, tired of translating my achievements into language they might value only to watch them redirect the conversation to Vanessa's latest corporate accomplishment. Tired of being small in my own family when I had built something genuinely substantial in the world beyond their dining room table. The week before the event felt like living in two different realities simultaneously, and the family group chat became a perfect microcosm of the dynamic I'd endured for years. Each message a small cut that individually seemed harmless, but collectively bled me dry of the hope that maybe this time would be different. Vanessa announced on Tuesday that she was bringing her boyfriend Marcus to support Emma's thing, with a casual tone that made my professional achievement sound like a child's recital, something to be endured rather than celebrated. And my mother responded with enthusiasm about meeting Marcus properly while barely acknowledging the event itself. The next day, my mother sent a direct message asking, "Is this finally about getting a real corporate position, sweetheart? Did one of your clients offer you something permanent?" And I stared at that message for 10 minutes, trying to decide how to respond, because even now, even with everything I'd built, her default assumption was that my business was a stepping stone to what she considered legitimate employment rather than a destination in itself. My father chimed in with practical skepticism, asking, "How formal is this really, Emma? Should I wear a suit, or is business casual fine?" And I could hear in his text the unspoken question of whether this was worth the effort of formal dress, worth taking seriously. I kept my responses deliberately vague, saying only, "It's a professional conference, please dress formally," because I had decided weeks ago that I wouldn't explain my role, wouldn't try once again to translate my success into words they might believe, wouldn't give them another opportunity to diminish what I'd accomplished before they saw it with their own eyes. Vanessa posted on Instagram 3 days before the event, a smiling selfie with the caption, "Taking a day off to support my sister's little business dreams, family first," and the phrase, "little business dreams," made my hands clench around my phone because she had no idea, no concept of what she'd be walking into, no understanding that her condescension was about to be exposed in front of 800 industry professionals. My best friend and business partner Jade called me that evening after seeing Vanessa's post and said bluntly, "Emma, they're going to lose their minds when they realize what you've actually built. Are you ready for that?" And I told her I thought I was ready, but honestly I wasn't sure, because part of me still feared that somehow even this wouldn't be enough, that they'd find a way to minimize an industry award and a keynote speech the same way they'd minimized everything else. My anxiety built steadily as the week progressed, and I kept asking myself the same questions on repeat. What if they dismiss it anyway? What if they leave early? What if I finally show them the truth and it still doesn't matter? The day before the event, I went to the Grand Marquis Hotel for rehearsal with the conference organizers, and the CEO of the organizing committee told me that my story was genuinely inspirational, that a self-made success at 32 who'd built a nearly $1 million consultancy from nothing was exactly the kind of speaker who motivated others in the industry. When he asked if my family would be attending, his face lit up as he said, "They must be so proud of everything you've accomplished." And I managed a hollow laugh that I didn't explain, because how do you tell someone that your family has no idea what you've accomplished? That they think they're attending a minor networking event? That you've been invisible in your own family for so long? You've started to wonder if your success is somehow imaginary despite the bank statements and client contracts that prove otherwise. That night, I couldn't sleep, reviewing my speech over and over, imagining my family's faces when they finally understood, rehearsing in my mind how I'd handle their shock, their apologies, their potential excuses, and wondering if this moment I'd been building toward would finally make them see me as I actually was, rather than who they'd decided I must be. The morning of the event, I woke at 5:30 with my heart already racing, and I arrived at the Grand Marquis Hotel Conference Center by 7, 2 full hours before the first attendees were scheduled to arrive, because I needed time to walk through the space and remind myself that this was real, that I had earned this moment, that my success wasn't something I'd imagined in the lonely hours of building my business while my family questioned every choice I made. The conference center was massive and elegant, all polished marble and soaring ceilings with crystal chandeliers. And as I walked through the main lobby, I saw my name everywhere, on banners hanging from the ceiling, on programs stacked at the registration desk, on the digital displays rotating through speaker information, and each time I saw Emma Richardson, digital marketing innovator, in bold professional typeface. Something inside me trembled between pride and disbelief. 800 attendees were expected according to the final count the organizers had given me, including industry leaders whose names I recognized from trade publications, journalists from major business media outlets, and marketing professionals from companies whose budgets exceeded what my entire hometown's economy probably generated in a year. I was wearing a tailored navy dress that I'd bought specifically for this event, professional and elegant, with my hair styled in a way that made me look polished and authoritative, and when I caught my reflection in the lobby windows, I barely recognized myself as the woman who used to shrink at family dinners, making herself smaller and quieter because nothing she said seemed to matter. My phone buzzed at 8:15 with a family group text confirming they were on their way, and my anxiety spiked so sharply I had to sit down on a bench near the registration area and practice the breathing exercises I'd learned from the YouTube videos I'd watched during my worst moments of self-doubt over the past 4 years. The event coordinators showed me to the backstage area where I could wait and watch the proceedings on monitors without being seen by the arriving attendees. And from that vantage point, I saw my family arrive at 9:30, my mother wearing the dress I'd bought her and looking slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the venue, my father in his best suit looking around with an expression I couldn't quite read, and Vanessa dramatically overdressed in a cocktail dress more appropriate for an evening gala than a professional conference, her boyfriend Marcus beside her, looking genuinely impressed by his surroundings. I watched on the monitor as Vanessa made loud comments in the lobby that I couldn't hear but could read in her animated gestures and the way other attendees glanced at her with mild annoyance, and I knew without hearing the words that she was already dismissing this event as excessive for what she assumed was my minor participation. They collected their registration packets at the desk, and I could see confusion cross their faces as they looked at the professional materials, the thick programs, the badge lanyards that marked this as a significant industry event rather than the casual networking thing Vanessa had described on social media. And Marcus said something that made him gesture around the space with what looked like appreciation, while Vanessa shook her head dismissively in response. My heart sank when I saw them choose seats in the middle section of the auditorium rather than the front row I'd specifically had reserved for them with their names on small cards that apparently they hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered to look for. And I realized they hadn't actually read their registration materials carefully enough to see that my name was listed not as an attendee, but as the keynote speaker and award recipient. I watched them settle into their seats, watched Vanessa already pulling out her phone, watched my mother lean over to say something to my father, who was glancing around the room with what might have been dawning awareness that this event was more significant than he'd anticipated, and my stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread, because in less than an hour, they were going to understand everything, and I had no idea if that understanding would finally make them see me, or if somehow, impossibly, they'd find a way to diminish even this. The opening remarks began at 9:45 with a vice president from the organizing committee welcoming attendees and outlining the day's agenda, and I watched on the backstage monitor as Vanessa leaned over to Marcus and whispered something that made her laugh, loud enough that the people in front of them turned around with annoyed expressions, and though I couldn't hear her exact words, I could read her body language perfectly after 29 years of being her older sister. She was making a joke about me, about this event, about what she assumed was my minor participation in something she'd already decided wasn't worth her full attention. My mother shushed her with a gesture, but then also started looking around the auditorium as if searching for me, probably scanning the room for whatever small booth or registration table she assumed I'd be stationed at. And my father pulled out the program and flipped through it with what looked like dutiful obligation rather than genuine interest, his eyes skimming over pages without really reading them, passing right over my name in the large, bold typeface that announced the keynote speaker without absorbing the information. The opening speaker, a well-respected industry analyst, began discussing digital marketing growth trends and innovation metrics, and I could see Vanessa's attention drift immediately to her phone, her thumb scrolling with the particular rhythm of someone checking social media. And sure enough, within 2 minutes, she was holding her phone at that specific angle people use when taking photos, and I knew with sick certainty that she was posting about this event with the same dismissive tone she'd used all week. Marcus tried to engage with the content, leaning forward slightly to listen to the speaker's points about emerging technologies. But Vanessa rolled her eyes in a way that was visible even on the monitor, and said something that made him sit back with what looked like resignation, and I imagined her saying something like, "You don't have to pretend to be interested. We'll leave after we spot Emma and take a photo," reducing my presence at this event to a checkbox on her daily to-do list, something to be gotten through and documented for social media before moving on to whatever actual plans she'd mentioned in her Instagram story. The opening remarks concluded, and the conference CEO walked to the podium with the kind of confident authority that comes from running major industry events, and he announced that they would now move to the awards segment of the program, and I watched my family on the monitor and felt my hands begin to shake because they weren't paying attention. They were still looking around the room for me, still assuming I was somewhere in the audience or manning some minor position, and my mother leaned over to Vanessa with a question I couldn't hear but could interpret from her gestures and Vanessa's responding shrug. They were asking how long they had to stay, when they could politely leave, treating this event that represented the culmination of 4 years of work and sacrifice and doubt as an obligation to be minimally fulfilled. Vanessa said something to Marcus that made her gesture toward the exits, and I knew she was already planning their escape route, already thinking past this moment to whatever restaurant or shopping or genuinely important activity she had scheduled for later, and the casual dismissiveness of that gesture, the absolute certainty in her posture that nothing happening in this auditorium could possibly be significant enough to warrant her full attention, made something in my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name, part anger, part vindication, part savage anticipation of the moment now less than 5 minutes away, when her entire understanding of reality was about to shatter. The event coordinator appeared at my elbow and said quietly, "You're on in 5 minutes, Ms. Richardson." And I nodded because I couldn't quite trust my voice, and I watched my family on that monitor, watched them existing in their comfortable assumption that they knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of, watched them preparing to leave early from an event they didn't understand, and I thought about all the family dinners where I'd tried to explain and been talked over, all the achievements I'd shared that had been met with silence or redirection. All the times I'd made myself smaller because being my full self seemed to make them uncomfortable. And I knew that in just a few minutes, none of that would be possible anymore because they were about to see me as I actually was, whether they were ready for it or not. The conference CEO walked to the podium with the Crystal Award already positioned on a small table beside him, and he adjusted the microphone before speaking in a voice that carried authority and warmth simultaneously, saying, "Now for the moment many of you have been anticipating, the presentation of our annual Digital Marketing Innovator Award." And I watched on the backstage monitor as Vanessa remained focused on her phone, her thumb still scrolling with that absent rhythm that indicated she'd completely checked out of the proceedings, while my parents sat politely attentive but clearly waiting for this segment to end so they could locate me somewhere in the venue. The CEO began listing the award criteria in his measured professional tone, explaining, "This recognition goes to an individual who has demonstrated exceptional revenue impact for their clients, innovative strategic thinking that advances our industry, and leadership that inspires others to excellence." And Marcus nudged Vanessa with his elbow and said something that made her look up from her phone with mild irritation. And though I couldn't hear his exact words, I saw him gesture toward the stage with an expression that suggested he was telling her to pay attention, since this was, after all, her professional field. Vanessa said something back that made her wave her hand dismissively, and I could read her lips well enough to catch Rachel Chen and Portland, and I realized she was telling Marcus that she already knew who won the award because she'd seen it mentioned in a trade journal or industry newsletter, her tone suggesting that this was settled information that didn't require her attention. And the bitter irony of that assumption made something twist in my chest, because she was so absolutely certain she knew what was happening, so comfortable in her understanding of her place in the industry hierarchy and mine. The CEO continued with the award description, his voice building with enthusiasm as he said, "This year's recipient built a consultancy from absolutely nothing to nearly $1 million in annual revenue in just 4 years." And I saw my father perk up slightly at the mention of that dollar amount, his businessman's instinct responding to numbers even when he wasn't fully engaged with the content, while my mother shifted in her seat and actually stopped looking around the room to focus on the stage. This remarkable individual generated over $4 million in measurable revenue for a Fortune 500 client through an innovative campaign that has already become a case study in strategic excellence, the CEO said. And Vanessa leaned toward Marcus to say something, and I watched her mouth form the words, "That's actual success, unlike," before my mother reached over and shushed her with a sharp gesture, saying something that looked like, "We should listen." And for the first time since they'd sat down, my family was actually paying full attention to what was happening on stage. The CEO began describing the winning campaign strategy in specific detail, outlining the multi-platform approach and the proprietary analytics methodology and the innovative audience segmentation technique, and these were my methods. My proprietary systems that I developed over 4 years of trial and error and late nights and constant refinement. And I saw Marcus suddenly sit up straighter and turn to Vanessa with an expression of dawning realization, saying something that made her look at him with confusion. And I read his lips saying, "Wait, this sounds like what Emma does." Vanessa actually laughed, a short dismissive sound I couldn't hear, but could see in the way her shoulders shook, and she said something back to him that I could partially read as, "Emma does social media posts for local shops." Her entire posture radiating amused disbelief that Marcus would even make such a comparison, and in that moment, I saw crystallized everything that was about to shatter because she was so certain, so absolutely confident in her diminished understanding of who I was and what I'd built. The CEO paused for dramatic effect, and I felt my hands trembling as I stood in the wings waiting for my cue, and he said with genuine warmth in his voice, "Please welcome our award recipient and keynote speaker." And the pause that followed felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only 2 seconds. And then my professional headshot appeared on the massive screens flanking the stage, 20 feet tall, and absolutely unmistakable, and the CEO's voice rang out clear and proud through the auditorium. Emma Richardson! The auditorium erupted in applause, 800 people rising to their feet in a wave of sound that seemed to physically roll toward the stage, and for a moment that felt suspended outside of normal time. My family remained frozen in their seats like figures in a photograph, their faces showing expressions I'd never seen before. Shock and confusion and disbelief all mixed together in a way that would have been comical if it weren't so painfully vindicating. I walked onto the stage with legs that felt steadier than I'd expected despite the trembling in my hands, my professional persona carrying me forward with the confidence I'd built over 4 years of client presentations and negotiation meetings and pitch sessions, and I was distantly aware that I looked composed and polished and exactly like someone who deserved to be accepting this award in front of 800 industry leaders. Vanessa's face had drained of all color, her mouth actually hanging open in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years, and my mother gasped audibly enough that I could hear it even over the applause, her hand reaching out to grab my father's arm with enough force that he winced even as he stared at the stage and then down at his program and then back at the stage, as if trying to make the reality in front of him match up with his understanding of the world. I accepted the Crystal Award from the CEO, feeling the substantial weight of it in my hands, and approached the microphone with my heart hammering but my voice ready, and I let myself make eye contact with my family for just a moment, taking in their stunned expressions with a feeling I couldn't quite name, not triumph exactly, something more complex and bittersweet than that simple word could contain. Vanessa was frantically scrolling through her phone with shaking hands, pulling up the conference program and checking it against what her eyes were telling her, seeking verification for something that didn't make sense within her framework of who I was and what I was capable of. And Marcus leaned over to whisper something to her that I later learned was, "I think you got this really wrong." His face showing discomfort at finding himself in the middle of a family dynamic he was just beginning to understand. Vanessa's response was something like, "This can't be, she never said," her voice carrying a note of almost desperate confusion, and my mother was saying, "Oh my God, that's our Emma. That's our daughter," as if she needed to verbally confirm the reality unfolding in front of her because her eyes alone couldn't be trusted. I began my speech with a thank you that came out steadier than I'd feared, and then I said, 4 years ago, I left corporate life to start my consulting business, letting the words settle over the audience, and particularly over my family, who had never quite understood that conscious choice as anything other than failure to compete in the traditional workplace. And my voice had a confidence and authority to it that was completely different from the tentative way I spoke at family dinners when I tried to share my achievements. Many people told me I was making a mistake, I continued, letting my eyes drift toward my family again. That I needed a real job. The phrase hung in the air with deliberate weight, and I saw my father physically wince at words he'd said to me at least a dozen times over the past 4 years, his face showing the first real recognition that his casual dismissiveness had been heard and felt and remembered. I began describing the early days of building my business from my spare bedroom, talking about my first client and my first success, and the slow accumulation of credibility and expertise, and I watched Vanessa slump in her seat as realization seemed to dawn about every dismissive comment she'd made, every mocking text she'd sent, every time she'd reduced my work to something trivial and unworthy of respect or attention. I moved deeper into my speech with a steadiness that came from having finally reached the moment I'd been building toward for 4 years, and I shared the specific business milestones without self-pity or excessive emotion, simply stating the facts of what I'd accomplished as the objective achievements they were, saying, that first year, I worked 80-hour weeks while people who loved me questioned whether I was making a terrible mistake, and I let my eyes drift toward my family again as I said it. Not accusatory, but simply honest about the context in which I'd built everything they were now seeing. I continued, I learned to measure success internally, not by others' understanding of what I was doing. And this line hit my mother visibly because I saw her hand go to her mouth and tears begin to slide down her cheeks as she recognized herself in that statement, recognized all the times she'd failed to understand, and had let that lack of understanding translate into lack of support. I shifted into describing the Fortune 500 campaign in detailed professional terms, walking through the strategic approach and the measurable outcomes and the innovative methodology that had generated $4.2 million in client revenue. And this was undeniable professional accomplishment, laid out in language that even skeptics couldn't dismiss. And I saw the industry leaders in the front rows nodding and taking notes, because this was the kind of case study that became teaching material. My confidence was growing with each sentence, 4 years of suppressed pride finally emerging in a context where it was not only appropriate but expected. And I said with clear emphasis, my revenue this year will exceed $900,000, and my team has grown to 6 full-time contractors who depend on the business I've built. And I watched my father doing calculations in his head, his expression shifting from shock to something that looked like respect as he processed what those numbers actually meant in terms of business success and financial stability. But I didn't want them to think this was only about money, so I said, "But numbers aren't the whole story, they're just the easiest way to measure what I've built." And I described the client transformations I'd facilitated, the small businesses I'd helped grow, the entrepreneurs I'd mentored, the real impact my work had beyond the revenue figures, because I wanted them to understand that I'd built something meaningful and not just profitable. I proved to myself that unconventional paths can lead to extraordinary outcomes, I said, and this was pointed but not cruel, taking the high road while making my point absolutely clear, and that other people's definitions of success don't have to become the boundaries of your own ambition. Vanessa was crying now, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face, and the shock had been completely replaced by what looked like shame, as she sat there absorbing every word, and presumably thinking about every dismissive comment she'd made, every mocking text, every time she'd reduced my work to something trivial. I moved toward my conclusion, sharing my philosophy about the industry and about professional success more broadly, saying, "Success looks different for everyone, and titles don't define worth. And the most important validation is the kind you can give yourself when you know you've done something excellent." And though these words were ostensibly directed at the industry audience in front of me, I knew my family heard them as the direct rebuke they were to years of valuing Vanessa's corporate title over my entrepreneurial achievement. I concluded with my vision for the industry's future and my place in shaping it, cementing my expertise in a way that left no room for doubt about whether I belonged on this stage. And when I finished the final sentence, the auditorium erupted again into a standing ovation that felt like it lasted for minutes. And I stood there holding the crystal award high above my head, letting myself finally feel the pride I'd earned. I exited the stage through the side curtain with adrenaline surging through my body so intensely I felt almost lightheaded, and immediately I was surrounded by a crowd of industry colleagues offering congratulations and requesting consultations, their faces showing the kind of professional respect I'd worked 4 years to earn, and business cards were being exchanged rapidly as people pressed close to talk about potential collaborations and speaking opportunities. The press was there too, journalists from trade publications wanting interviews and quotes. And I was answering questions about my methodology while simultaneously processing the fact that somewhere in this building, my family was presumably dealing with the complete destruction of their understanding of who I was and what I'd accomplished. Through the crowd of bodies and congratulations, I caught sight of movement near the backstage entrance, and my stomach dropped as I saw my family approaching, their faces showing an uncertainty and hesitation that was completely foreign to the confident way they usually moved through the world. Security initially stopped them because they didn't have VIP passes, and I watched my father trying to explain that they were my family, while the security guard politely but firmly indicated that backstage was restricted. and I felt a moment of petty satisfaction before I signaled to the guard to let them through, my heart pounding as they made their way toward me through the crowd of industry professionals. My mother reached me first, pushing through the cluster of colleagues, with tears still streaming down her face, and she said, "Sweetheart, we had no idea," with her voice breaking on the words, in a way that might have softened me if I hadn't spent 4 years trying to make them understand what they were now seeing. My father was right behind her, his face showing an emotion I couldn't quite read, something between shame and pride and confusion, and he said, "Emma, I don't have words. I'm sorry." And the simple apology felt both inadequate and more honest than anything he'd said to me about my career in years. Vanessa hung back several feet away, unable to meet my eyes, her mascara-streaked face showing the kind of raw vulnerability I'd rarely seen from her, and Marcus stood beside her looking deeply uncomfortable at finding himself in the middle of a family reckoning he hadn't anticipated when he agreed to attend what he'd thought would be a minor networking event. My mother reached out as if to hug me, then seemed to realize she wasn't sure if she had that right anymore, and she said, "Why didn't you tell us? We would have celebrated, we would have—" And I interrupted her gently but firmly, saying, "I tried, many times, you weren't listening." And the truth of that statement settled over all of them like a physical weight. The silence that followed felt thick and uncomfortable, and I could see my parents exchanging glances that contained entire conversations about their behavior and their blind spots and their failures. And then the conference CEO appeared at my elbow, his face bright with professional pride, saying, "Emma, Bloomberg wants an interview for their entrepreneurship section. Is this your family?" He turned to my parents without waiting for my answer, his enthusiasm genuine and unaware of the tension he was stepping into, and he said, "You must be incredibly proud. Emma's revolutionizing the industry with her approach to integrated digital strategy." And my father's voice came out thick with emotion as he replied, "We are. We should have shown it better." And I saw him struggle visibly with the weight of what that admission actually meant. I gestured toward a small private conference room off the main backstage area, and my family followed me in silence, their usual confidence completely stripped away as I closed the door behind us and shut out the noise of the continuing event, and we stood there for a moment in the quiet room with its generic hotel furniture and fluorescent lighting before I said, "We should talk properly," keeping my voice calm despite the emotion churning inside me. Vanessa was the first to speak, her voice breaking as she said, "Emma, I'm so sorry. I was horrible. I was—" And then she trailed off as if she couldn't find words adequate to describe what she'd been, and I let the silence sit there between us because I wasn't going to rush to comfort her or make this easier when nothing about the last 4 years had been easy for me. After a long moment, Vanessa tried again, saying, "I was jealous. I saw you doing something brave, taking a risk I was too afraid to take, and I diminished it to make myself feel better about playing it safe." And this admission seemed to open something in the room, because my mother spoke next, saying, "We all did. We compared you two instead of celebrating you both, and we let competition poison what should have been support." My father was struggling visibly with emotion, his usual composed financial advisor demeanor completely cracked, and he said, "I pushed my definition of success onto you, and I couldn't see past my own narrow understanding of what a career should look like." And these apologies were landing, but not quite reaching the depth of hurt they needed to address. I took a breath and said, "I needed you to believe in me, to ask questions about what I was actually doing instead of assuming it was small or insignificant, to listen when I tried to share my wins instead of changing the subject." And then I started describing specific moments because I needed them to understand this wasn't about one incident, but a pattern stretching back years, saying, "My college graduation where I finished summa cum laude and you spent the dinner talking about Vanessa's engagement. My first $100,000 year when I brought champagne and you said we'd celebrate later but never did. Every family dinner where I tried to explain my business and got interrupted or met with skepticism." My voice was steady, But I could feel the accumulated pain of those years in every word, and I continued. I made myself smaller at family dinners because nothing I said seemed to matter. And it was easier to be quiet than to keep hitting that wall of indifference. My mother was sobbing now, her face in her hands, and she said through her tears, "We made you feel invisible." But I shook my head and said, "Not invisible, just less than. Like I was always disappointing you, like I was the problem child who couldn't figure out how to succeed the right way." Vanessa's face crumpled further and she said, "I posted mocking things on social media today. Before I knew, before I understood." And I met her eyes and said quietly, "I saw them," and watched fresh shame wash over her as she realized I'd been aware of her mockery, even as I stood backstage preparing to accept an award she didn't think I deserved. I continued, needing them to understand my choice not to tell them, saying, "I didn't tell you the specifics about today because I wanted you to see it, not just hear me describe it, because every time I tried to explain my success, you changed the subject or minimized it or found a way to make it smaller than it was." And my father said, "You're right, completely right. How do we fix this?" And the question hung in the air as I considered whether it could even be fixed or if some damage was simply permanent. I looked at my father's question hanging in the air and said quietly, "I don't know if you can fix it, but you can change going forward." Because the truth was that 4 years of dismissal and mockery couldn't be erased by apologies in a conference room, no matter how sincere they seemed in this moment of shock and revelation. Vanessa completely broke down then, her whole body shaking as she said, "I ruined everything between us. I destroyed our relationship because I was petty and jealous and cruel." And then she started listing her cruelties as if confession could somehow absolve her, saying the mocking texts, the dismissive comments at every family gathering, the social media posts making fun of your work, and worse than all of that. She paused, struggling to continue, then forced out, "I told people at my office that you were struggling financially. I lied about your life to make myself look better by comparison, like I was the successful sister who had it together while you were floundering." I felt that revelation hit me physically, pain flickering across my face as I absorbed the fact that she'd been actively damaging my reputation to people I didn't even know. And Marcus looked at Vanessa with something like horror and said firmly, "Vanessa, you need to own this fully, all of it," giving her a look that suggested this wasn't the woman he thought he'd been dating. Vanessa nodded miserably and continued, "I called your business a hobby to Mom, multiple times. I told her I was concerned about you, that maybe you needed help facing reality about your career situation." And my mother gasped and said, "That influenced how I saw things. I thought I was helping by pushing you toward corporate stability. I thought I was being a good mother by trying to guide you toward security." And I shook my head and said, "You both were working from wrong information. Because no one asked me directly about my actual business, my actual revenue, my actual client list or success metrics." My father spoke up, his voice heavy with regret, saying, "I assumed. I saw you working from home in casual clothes, and I thought it meant small-scale operations, maybe a few $100s here and there, not real income." And I felt the weight of all their assumptions pressing down on the space between us. I said, "My first $100,000 year. I tried to celebrate with you. I brought champagne to Sunday dinner. You were planning Vanessa's promotion party, and you said we'd celebrate my news later." And my mother's face crumpled as the memory clearly came back to her. And she said, "Oh God, you brought champagne. We said we'd celebrate later." And I finished the thought by saying simply, "We never did," letting those 3 words carry the weight of that forgotten promise and all the other forgotten moments like it. Vanessa was crying so hard now she could barely speak, but she managed to say, I knew you were hurt that day, and I felt powerful, like I'd won something. I'm so ashamed I can barely breathe." And the rawness of her admission was almost hard to witness. But I didn't move to comfort her, because this discomfort was necessary, and perhaps long overdue. I took a breath and said what they all needed to hear, what I needed to say, which was, I need time. This isn't fixed by one conversation, no matter how honest we're being right now. You've seen the truth today, but that doesn't erase 4 years of making me feel worthless. I needed to return to the reception because there were industry leaders waiting to network, and this event wasn't just about my family drama, Zanib. It was about my professional life that I'd built despite their dismissal. And when I told my family I had to go back out there, my mother said, "Can we stay? Can we watch?" And I hesitated because part of me wanted them gone so I could enjoy this triumph without their sudden interest contaminating it. But another part of me wanted exactly what she was asking for, which was for them to see my actual world, my real professional life that they'd never bothered to learn about. I said, "Stay if you want to learn, not perform. This isn't about making yourselves look good." And the boundary in my voice was clear, and they all nodded, chastened. So I walked back out into the reception area with my family trailing behind me at a respectful distance, and immediately I was surrounded by colleagues and industry leaders wanting to talk about the speech and the award and potential collaborations. A woman I recognized as the CEO of a major marketing firm approached me saying, "Emma, your campaign case study is part of our curriculum now at the Training Institute. You've changed how we teach conversion strategy." And I felt pride surge through me, because this was the kind of recognition I'd worked toward, validation from people who actually understood what I'd built. Another executive approached asking, "We want you to consult on our Fortune 100 account. Name your rate. Seriously, whatever you think is fair." And I was discussing figures that would have seemed impossible 4 years ago, while my family stood 15 feet away taking in every word. And I saw my mother whisper to my father, "She's been living this life, and we knew nothing about it. We knew nothing." Vanessa was watching me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, something between awe and grief, watching me move through conversations with ease and authority, seeing the respect people showed me, the way they listened when I spoke and took notes on what I said. And a young woman, probably 25 or 26, approached me somewhat nervously, saying, "Ms. Richardson, I just wanted to tell you that your journey inspired me to start my own consultancy 6 months ago. I was terrified to leave corporate, but your interviews gave me courage." And I felt my heart squeeze because this was why I'd been willing to be vulnerable about my story, to help other people see that unconventional paths were valid. I was generous with my time with her, offering specific advice about client acquisition and pricing strategy, mentoring her naturally the way I wished someone had mentored me. And then Jade arrived, my business partner who'd been at a client meeting during the speech, and she spotted my family immediately and came over to me saying quietly, "Want me to run interference? I can get them out of here if you need." Because she knew the whole history and had held me through many tearful nights when family gatherings had gutted me. I shook my head and said, "No, they're seeing reality now." That's what I needed. And Jade squeezed my hand in understanding and stayed close as an industry journalist approached, asking to interview me about my business philosophy and growth strategy. And my family watched as I articulated my approach to digital marketing, discussed my goals for scaling the business, explained my success metrics and client selection process. And I could see them hearing the expertise in my voice, seeing this side of me that had always existed, but they'd never witnessed because they'd never asked. They'd never been interested enough to look. Vanessa said something to Marcus that I couldn't hear, but I saw her face crumple again, saw her shake her head, and later Marcus would tell me she'd said, "She's been this person the whole time. We just refused to see it." The event was winding down as the last clusters of networking conversations dissolved into goodbyes, and the hotel staff began subtly clearing reception tables, and I felt exhaustion settling into my bones alongside a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with my family and everything to do with the professional triumph I'd earned through 4 years of relentless work. My family was still present, lingering near the lounge area, and when I finished my final conversation with a potential client from Seattle, they approached hesitantly, and my father said, "Can we talk more? We don't want this day to end with so much still unresolved. So I nodded and led them to a quiet corner in the hotel lounge where leather chairs clustered around a low table, and the lighting was dim enough to feel private. My father spoke first, leaning forward with his hands clasped, saying, "I want to understand your business, really understand it, not just the surface level. Will you teach me? Will you walk me through what you actually do?" And the request surprised me because he'd never asked before, not once in 4 years. And my mother added, "I want to celebrate properly. Your achievements, all of them retroactively, every milestone we missed or dismissed." But I shook my head gently and said, "I don't need a party. I need respect. Day to day, consistently. I need you to listen when I talk about my work and ask real questions instead of changing the subject." Vanessa, who'd been sitting quietly with red-rimmed eyes, said, "I need to work on myself. I see now how toxic I've been, how much damage I caused." And I looked at her directly and said, "You have real achievements too. This wasn't a competition. Your job is legitimate. Your success is real." And then I added, because it needed to be said, "But you made it one. You turned our relationship into a competition where only one of us could win, and Mom and Dad let you." My parents didn't defend themselves, just absorbed the truth of that statement, and my father nodded slowly and said, "We did. We set up that dynamic, and we're responsible for it." And I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that they were finally hearing me. I pulled out my business card, the professional materials I'd had designed 6 months ago, things they'd never asked to see, and I walked them through my actual client list, showed them testimonials from Fortune 500 companies and small businesses alike, explained the industry recognition I'd received beyond just today's award, and my father studied the revenue figures I showed him on my phone and said quietly, "This is extraordinary, Emma, truly extraordinary." And I met his eyes and said, "I know. I've known. I needed you to know." We made plans for dinner the following week, a proper dinner where I would present my business the way I should have been able to all along. And as we stood to leave, Vanessa caught my arm and asked with desperate hope, "Can you forgive me eventually? Is that possible?" And I considered the question honestly before saying, "Maybe. But trust takes time to rebuild. You can't erase 4 years of cruelty with apologies, no matter how sincere." And she nodded, accepting that boundary, and said, "I'll do whatever it takes, however long it takes." And I believed she meant it in that moment, though I knew the real test would be consistency over months and years, not promises made in the emotional aftermath of public humiliation. 3 months later, I sat at my parents' dining room table for our monthly family dinner, and the atmosphere was so completely different from every meal that had come before that sometimes I felt disoriented by the transformation. And when I started talking about my current project with a healthcare technology company, everyone leaned in with genuine interest, and my father asked specific questions about conversion metrics that showed he'd actually been studying digital marketing concepts to understand my work better. Vanessa waited until I'd finished sharing my update completely before she said, "Emma landed another Fortune 500 client this week, her third this quarter." And then she shared her own news about a successful campaign launch at her company. And the fact that she'd celebrated my win before talking about herself felt like a small miracle every single time it happened. My mother had framed my Digital Marketing Innovator Award and displayed it prominently in the living room, where she used to keep only Vanessa's corporate headshots and achievement certificates. And my father had started telling his golf friends about my business with pride and surprising accuracy, actually explaining what digital marketing consulting involved instead of vaguely dismissing it. The family WhatsApp group had transformed too, with genuine engagement when I posted about client wins or speaking opportunities, real questions and congratulations, instead of the silence that used to greet my milestones. And Vanessa had been working steadily on relationship repair through regular coffee dates, where she mostly just listened and let me talk about whatever I needed to say without trying to fix things or make excuses. My business had hit 1.2 million in annual revenue, and I'd expanded my team to 9 people with plans to bring on 3 more by year end, and I'd been invited to speak at 3 more major conferences, including one international event in London that had my mother already planning to come watch. Forbes had featured me in a retrospective piece about unconventional success stories, titling it 30 Under 35 Revisited: Entrepreneurs Who Proved the Skeptics Wrong. And when the article came out, my parents had bought 10 copies, and my father had actually cried, reading the part where I talked about building success despite lack of family support, though I'd been careful not to name them specifically because public humiliation wasn't my goal, healing was. My family attended my next speaking event at a regional marketing summit, and they sat front row by choice this time, genuinely proud, and I could see my mother recording parts of my speech on her phone, and my father taking notes on the business insights I shared, and Vanessa's face showed pure pride without the shadow of resentment that used to darken every interaction between us. The relationship between Vanessa and me was slowly healing through honest conversations where she took full accountability and made real apologies that acknowledged specific harm instead of vague regret. And our parents had actually started attending therapy to understand and address the favoritism patterns they'd established, which meant more to me than any single apology could have because it showed commitment to real change. I reflected often on how the validation from my family felt good now that it was finally present, but I no longer needed it desperately the way I once had because I'd built genuine self-worth through my achievements and through proving to myself that I could create something meaningful regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. And my family's recognition had become a bonus rather than the foundation of my identity. I didn't regret the hard years despite all the pain they'd caused, because they'd forged resilience and self-reliance, and an unshakable belief in my own judgment that I might never have developed if everything had come easily. But I was genuinely glad that my family finally saw me clearly, really saw me as I actually was, instead of as a disappointing reflection of their expectations. I was preparing for my London keynote on a Tuesday afternoon when my phone lit up with messages from the family group chat. My mother sending encouragement about my upcoming speech, my father sharing an article about the conference that mentioned my participation, and Vanessa simply texting, "You're going to be amazing, Em. So proud of you." And I found myself smiling at my phone with uncomplicated happiness, the kind of warmth I'd always wanted from my family. And I realized that the girl who'd stood on that stage 3 months ago accepting an award her family hadn't known she'd earned would barely recognize the peace I felt now, sitting in my home office that was no longer a source of family shame, but a respected headquarters of a business they'd finally learned to value.